When I say narrative excellence in video games, one of the game studios that will come to mind is Bioware. And Bioware have put out a lot of very good games with very good stories. And when you think about Bioware games with good stories, you probably think of Mass Effect, right? Well, up until the ending of Mass Effect 3. But there was another intellectual property of BioWare's that was concurrent with Mass Effect. And it's often overlooked, I think. And I think it's overlooked unfairly. And that is Dragon Age. I decided on my stream to go back and play Dragon Age Origins. And as I was playing it, I kind of came to this gradual realization that Dragon Age Origins might be the last of a very particular kind of game that BioWare made. It is in a lot of ways the peak of that form of game. And what I mean by that is that Dragon Age Origins could be seen as the inflection point from BioWare being this all-conquering game studio that are famous for wonderful narratives, all the way to the situation they're in now where they basically don't come up on my radar at all for game stuff. I actually looked into the games that BioWare has been making or has in development. There is going to be a new Dragon Age and a new Mass Effect game, which astounds me, but I guess, go back to the well and see what happens. This video is going to be me trying to justify the idea that came into my head, that Dragon Age Origins is the last true BioWare masterpiece. For now, we don't know. I'm not going to prejudge the games before they've come out, but I suspect it might remain the case. When I talk about a type of game, we need to go back to the last video I made reviewing a game, which is the one about Disco Elysium. Now, Disco Elysium was consistently compared to Planescape Torment. Again, I will note, a game I haven't played, so I couldn't really comment on the comparison, but I tried to draw a comparison between it and Baldur's Gate. And Baldur's Gate, rather funnily, is the first video game I remember playing. I must have been like 5 or 6 or something like that, and my parents just had a CD of one of the most important RPG games of all time lying around their house in the early 2000s. Why? How this happened? We've actually never been able to figure it out. We've never got to the bottom of it, but it is nonetheless what happened. Now, what I didn't appreciate as a 6 or 7-year-old that I was at the time, this game is actually credited with rescuing the role-playing game genre. It does this very clever thing, which eventually became the norm, where it's based on a D&D system, but it hides the roles from you. It sort of simulates it for you, and it presents this nice looking graphical depiction of what's happening. Now, Baldur's Gate was maybe not as action-packed as its contemporaries. It didn't present itself as sleekly or elegantly or beautifully, although, to be fair, remember we're talking about 1998, so there's limits to beauty in this case. In fact, if it was 1998, I've just realised I must have been 4 or 5 years old, which I definitely did not understand anything about the game at the time. I just liked the chance to just click around and I would keep getting into fights with the guards, which it turns out was not a great idea, but not the point. But Baldur's Gate had an advantage over these other games. The advantage was the way it structured its narratives and presented it to you. So Baldur's Gate was, by all reporting at the time, quite a compelling game with a compelling narrative. It was also quite unique in that it presented side quests with a significant amount of context so that the player would feel invested in doing the side quests, which seems kind of obvious when you think about it, but you got to remember that devoting time to side quests is effort that can be used elsewhere in a game's development, but it turns out might be worth it if you want to present this fleshed out big world. And that's kind of the lineage of Dragon Age. Dragon Age is very much the last of this kind of game. And in a way, the basicness of Dragon Age, because the setting of Dragon Age is quite basic in a way that it could just be a typical fantasy setting from basically anyone's D&D campaign. And the basicness of Dragon Age is where it gets a lot of its power from, right? Because it is just your traditional fantasy RPG narrative. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. Not everything has to be a unique twist on a particular genre. Sometimes the classics are a classic for a reason. And the strength of the narrative in Dragon Age is not that it deviates massively from known formulas, it's that it executes the known formulas well. Now, admittedly, I have to be honest, in my playthrough of it, I had forgotten how irritating some of the characters could be. Alistair in particular, although actually I wasn't really meant to name names in this, but I'm going to name him Alistair. He is... I think that style of humour stopped being funny for me possibly a little bit after I turned 18. So, you know, just not as interested in that style of humour anymore. Now, I do have to kind of talk about my stream playthrough a little. I encountered what we might call a significant number of crashes playing it. Now, part of this is because it's an old game. It was released in 2009. And yes, you know, I forgave Fallout New Vegas in my review of it for its flaws in that regard. And yes, one of my viewers had to come to the rescue and tell me, oh, well, here's the mod list that fixes the game, and here's a little workaround that sort of stops it from constantly exploding every once in a while, which is good. I'm glad that someone was there to do that for me. That's very helpful. Now, when I'm talking about the gameplay of it, think back to Baldur's Gate if you've ever played Baldur's Gate. You might have played the Enhanced Edition. So, you know, think back to Baldur's Gate. It presents the role-playing game action in real time to you. And yeah, you can set up tactical positions and stuff like that. And you can do that in Dragon Age, right? You can pause, plan out each move. If you so choose, you can just plan out each and every move for each and every one of your party members. The benefit of this particular choice to sort of hide the sort of tabletop lair is that it means that you don't have to learn an extensive rule set to play. You can just jump on and play it. I mean, how many people back in 1998 would have been able to pick up, and it was an AD&D, I think it was an AD&D rule set, and just go and do AD&D without any knowledge of the rules? But you could do that in Baldur's Gate, right? I, as a 4-year-old or 5-year-old, I've genuinely forgotten how old I was when I played this, did not know anything about D&D. I didn't even know fucking Forgotten Realms were, which was the setting. And speaking of settings, the setting of Dragon Age Origins is what is essentially an England analogue. And that works for a lot of reasons. England is the basis of a lot of fantasy settings. Very funnily, the story seems to revolve around a petty nationalist dicking over the entire country in the middle of a crisis. Stop me if that sounds familiar. The actual narrative of the game is kind of typical. It's kind of boring. It's almost not the interesting part of the game. You have this situation where a big evil is emerging. The big evil is represented in the form of a possibly in that very fantasy way kind of racist enemy in the form of the Darkspawn as a sort of ravaging unknown horde. Although also the Qunari are kind of not great in that sense. And the Qunari, in case you're wondering, you have a party member called Sten, or the Sten, because it's actually his occupation, who is the Qunari are basically an additional fantasy race that's unique to the Dragon Age world. It's more of a culture, but I suppose that's kind of not the point. There are the Qunari, the people, and there's Qunari, the culture. And as someone in my Twitch chat pointed out, this is very clearly what the developers seem to think communists or Muslims are like. Because there's a bit of an Ottoman Empire-y vibe I pick up from the Qunari that I suppose that my chat were also picking up. Not a criticism as such, but it's interesting when you look at the Qunari how they're depicted. I've been sidetracked from the story a little bit, let's get back to the story. It's a very typical fantasy story. The large evil appears, there's a smaller evil who causes the larger evil to kick off. You need to deal with the smaller evil before you deal with the larger evil, and so you go off questing and solving everyone's problems for them. And you level up, you get stronger, you collect a colourful cast of characters, including a weird witch lady from the wilds, a really drunk dwarf guy. You also pick up an elvish assassin. You manage to find a strange, not French woman who's in a church who seems to be suspiciously good at fighting for a woman who's in a church. You find a sort of nagging grandmother figure to be a healer. I'm basically trying to remember the entire party off the top of my head, but actually, to be fair, you do find a dog, and the dog is fantastic. He is the goodest boy. Now, this narrative simplicity provides a good structure, right? It means you can fill it in with whatever colour you like, because it's so well worn and well tread that it's a narrative structure that almost everyone can engage with and understand. And the way I've just described that, bear that in mind, because this narrative structure, it's kind of like a fractal. It replicates itself in smaller and smaller patterns in, side quests and the quests that are stepping stones along the way. Now, this is fine. Bioware filled the structure up with lots of interesting side quests and characters, even characters who are sympathetic, characters who are obviously terrible at lying in some cases. I actually just in my stream playthrough, as of recording, got to Redcliffe and found that very shifty looking elf fella who is very clearly there to spy on people, and I basically just bullied him into joining the militia to defend the village, which was good. It was the correct decision. Now, this simplicity and the way that they managed to fill out the simple structure is a massive strength. It means that what we interact with is, one, a well-worn structure so it's hard to fuck up, but two, actually having a structure in place frees up effort for you to make compelling side quests and compelling side characters and people who you actually want to interact with. Now, obviously, it doesn't work 100% of the time. It's not perfect, but it's definitely worthy of being in that lineage from Baldur's Gate. Now, I do have to address some of the more difficult aspects of the game. So, because of the constant crashing, it was easy to lose a lot of progress, which was a bit annoying. Now, that is, look, it was never tested to work on a machine like the one that I use for streaming. Alright, that's life. No one's mad at it. Well, I'm a little mad at it, but anyway, who cares what I think, right? I guess you, if you're on the video. I don't know why I said that. When I was playing the game again, I was surprised a little bit to remember how much I enjoyed it. And actually, Dragon Age Origins, it's still fun to me to play, which is really mission accomplished as a game. And Dragon Age Origins at various points does have these sort of very compelling alternative options for you to pick from. For example, and by the way, this is going to be a review with spoilers, if you were to take on the Isle of Redcliffe's quest and try and, stop him from dying, which I suppose would be quite important in the context of the game, the Urn of Sacred Ashes is something that you end up going looking for. And it's actually the subject of one of these insanely well-produced trailers they had for Dragon Age Origins, which, by the way, unnecessarily good. Don't, just unnecessarily good. It's probably not something that's worth thinking about, really, because it's so unrepresentative of the game, but also it has this really banging, rock track to it at times, and it just does look very cool. So, especially for 2007, which is 2008, maybe, when it was made. But anyway, you can choose to defile the ashes. Now, defiling the ashes of the prophet of the main religion in the game is what some might consider to be a big fucking deal. And in fact, one of your party members, if you do defile the ashes in front of her, will turn on you and try and kill you. But the payoff for that is that you get access to an extremely powerful class type in the game, because as well as there being sort of regular classes, you know, your rogue, your fighter, your mage, there are class specializations as in D&D, and you can't automatically specialize. You have to find, you know, a book that explains it to you, or someone who's willing to teach you, or, you know, you defile the ashes and get given the power of like a reaver who can absorb the life force of your enemies because of a dragon or some shit. Look, it doesn't have to make sense, it's a fantasy game. But these choices and these payoffs are often quite well balanced, right? If you go to the dwarves' homeland in Ferelden, which is Orzammar, you are presented with a society in political gridlock, and you are in charge of, you know, ending the political gridlock. And it is a long, winding quest that is one of the 2 areas of the game that comes in for quite a bit of criticism, but I will actually address one bit of that criticism in a little bit. But you feel like you're making a meaningful decision for this society. That sense that your decisions are meaningful, that they impact the lives of these people in the game, lends weight to it. And that's important in a role-playing game where the idea is that your decisions matter and are consequential. You need to be able to feel the weight of the decisions you make, and in this case, you do. And in the quest, for example, the first quest I did on my last playthrough is the Circle of Magi, which is also subject to the other bit of the game that's very, very controversial and disliked, which is the Fade, but I will address the Fade shortly. But you are presented with a choice to either kill everyone in the tower or try and save people. Now, killing everyone in the tower is probably a little bit easier, but it does have consequences with your relationship with other characters, right? It means you can't get a certain companion, and so on and so on. And so this balancing of consequence and advantage is actually done very well in this game. And one of the things I actually quite like about Dragon Age Origins is that it doesn't have an explicit morality meter, because games that have explicit morality meters, by design consequence, pull characters towards the middle ground. It's this subset of this take that I keep having, which is that every single morality scale RPG protagonist is a centrist. Commander Shepard, centrist. Revan in KOTOR, centrist. And actually KOTOR is kind of relevant to this, but we will be coming to that in a sec. Now, I do want to address the elephant in the room, which is the Fade. I very deliberately went to the Circle of Magi first, so that we definitely had footage of me bumbling around the Fade. Now, there are 2 main criticisms of the Fade. One is that people keep getting lost in it, which, yeah, that happened to me at least once. I don't begrudge people that complaint. And 2, that it's too long. It's too long and it's too much of a pain. Now, I want to defend the Fade, which is potentially the most controversial thing I'll do on this channel, is try and defend the Fade. There are 2 perspectives I want to defend the Fade from. One is from a design problem perspective, and the other one is from the perspective of actually enjoyable gameplay. Now, what is the design problem that they're trying to solve here? So think about your typical role-playing game, whether tabletop or video game. Think about your typical quest, right? Quest begins in place A, you go to place B. You're in place B, turns out there's a problem, you can't solve the quest there. Now you get to place C, and maybe it's resolvable there, maybe you're presented with a choice, you go to D or E, right? But the point is that your typical role-playing game quest, as an overarching thing, usually involves significant amounts of traveling, different environments, different enemy types, and different challenges, different types of challenges, you know, puzzles, or, well, there's a lot of puzzles actually in Dragon Age Origins, which is probably a tiny mark against it, because I'm going to be honest with you, I don't like puzzles because I'm not a very smart person, yes. Yes to both. This variety is a strength of the role-playing game as a form. Now, in the Circle of Magi, you are confronted primarily by abominations and blood mages, and also weirdly dragonlings, which I found to be quite a weird, out of context enemy to have, but they were there. So, yeah, okay, alright, cool. So I guess they were just lying around. If you were to take out the Fade, you would be constantly fighting in a single environment with the same enemy types up until you reach the big bad boss, who's Uldred and is a massive pain in the ass to kill. Now, that might be fine. You might argue that that is a better outcome from the gameplay perspective than the Fade. The Fade doesn't solve the problem, but the Fade is an attempt to solve this problem. I understand what they were going for. They might have swung and they might have missed, but at least they swung. They wanted this to have a structure of your typical role-playing game quest, which would involve different environments. And what is the Fade if not many different environments, and actually many different types of gameplay that you can engage in with the shapeshift? It was an attempt, and it probably stretched the mechanics of this particular type of RPG game too far. But it wasn't, when I was playing it, necessarily unenjoyable. But there's a big caveat there. I had a Twitch chat who told me where to go when I was lost. You, when you first played it in 2009, did not have a Twitch chat telling you where to go. And so I will understand if you dislike it. I don't think it's as big a war crime as people like to pretend it is. It's certainly not the most egregious design or narrative choice that Bioware have made, thinking about Mass Effect 2 and its depiction of a particular character, or Mass Effect 3's ending, or the fact that Dragon Age 2 recycled assets so much that it was plainly boring in a way that at least Dragon Age Origins, you know, has a variety. Even if everything's a shade of brown, it has this variety of room and dungeon and enemy type. Yeah, Dragon Age 2 was terrible. I want to think about the billing that I'm going to give for this game, which is that it's BioWare's last true masterpiece. So when I say that it's BioWare's last true masterpiece, I mean in the sense of it being a very particular kind of game that I think is a BioWare game, a particularly BioWare game, right? I'm thinking about Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter Nights, KOTOR, Jade Empire, Dragon Age, right? RPG games that are purely mechanically, structurally RPG in nature. Now, you might say, well, KOTOR has this sort of much better combat depiction than Dragon Age Origins. And yeah, the action in Dragon Age Origins is a bit dull. I'm not saying that it's an exciting action-packed game. That's because it's not an action RPG. It's not Mass Effect or Mass Effect 2. Although Mass Effect is kind of a sort of semi-permeable membrane between the action RPG and the RPG, because a little known fact about Mass Effect, where you aim on the enemy actually doesn't matter. It's actually determined by a statistical roll of your skill with the gun, which I always found to be quite funny. So it is, in a sense, Mass Effect could almost be the sort of BioWare type of game that we talked about here. But Dragon Age Origins did come out after Mass Effect. It did come out also just before Mass Effect 2. So why didn't I pick Mass Effect 2? Even though you might argue, and I might agree, that Mass Effect 2 is a better game than Dragon Age Origins. It's because it's the beginning of the departure from this type of game by BioWare. It's the move into sort of more marketable, sort of more general market style action role-playing game, which is fine. They can do that. But it means that it has become a different kind of game. A game where the primary action is you taking cover and trying to headshot the enemy is materially and significantly a different game from one where I have to micromanage who's drinking lyrium potions and who's drinking poultices. Which, as someone pointed out to me, poultices are not meant to be drunk. You're meant to, like, rub them onto you, which is a very funny image to imagine characters just covering themselves in a balm mid-battle, but which I suppose is why they animated them drinking it, to be honest. But the point was that this game is the last of a particular type of game that BioWare made, and it's the last of it being done very well. Now, we don't know what the new Mass Effect and new Dragon Age games will be like. They might be better than Dragon Age Origins. In fact, I would argue that if they don't crash every 15 minutes, that for most people it will probably be better as a gaming experience, but that remains to be seen as a recording. I don't know, maybe we'll play them and maybe we'll find out in a future video, but that is, as it stands, my position. I think it lives up to the billing I gave it. I think if, again, in the sort of spirit of Fallout New Vegas, if you apply the modifications correctly and do the workarounds, I think it's a perfectly fine game to play. I think it's very fun, and I think it's the culmination of everything BioWare was known for doing well into a single game. Now, I could have done this about KOTOR, though of course KOTOR was chronologically much earlier than Dragon Age Origins, because KOTOR, again, in a sense, actually structurally quite similar to Dragon Age. It's just filled out with a Star Wars skin, essentially, and Star Wars side quests. And that's fine, and it's a great game, but it doesn't work with capture software very well, which is why we ended up doing Dragon Age Origins. Now, you can take this essentially as me saying that maybe KOTOR is the last real masterpiece, but it's one that I cannot, as of right now, access. So you'll have to settle for Dragon Age Origins as the last true BioWare masterpiece. And think about how sad that is, that their last masterpiece of this variety came out in 2009. 2009, I was 15, which is very funny to me. Dragon Age Origins does also have an expansion, which is Awakening. I did also play Awakening when I was much younger. It is more of the same, essentially, but it's kind of more of a resource development-y kind of vibe on your way to go deal with the big bad. In quite a different way, in the way that Dragon Age Origins is about constructing an army to fight the Darkspawn, which you can do regardless of your sort of narrative choices. It is a little bit railroady in that sense, but at least there are different flavors of ending. It feels like it matters. Awakening requires you to make decisions as a sort of ruler, and while you're on your way to deal with the big bad. So again, they stuck to a winning formula. I think Awakening is probably also worth playing if you would like to do that, but otherwise, I think those are my main thoughts on Dragon Age Origins. It is still, to my mind, BioWare's last true masterpiece. Everyone, if you enjoyed that, just make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel. We do a game review a month. We usually do a big video SAE type thing a month. Last month's was sadly lost to the editing hell. So it will be out when it's out. It might be out before this video. Here's hoping, because it was really meant to be out a while ago, but CGI takes time. And with that in mind, I also want to thank all of my patrons who will either appear in a fancy graphic or on my wall now. There they are. Yeah, there's the patrons. And I particularly want to thank Drone Riff, Mercutio, Nauseum, and Kersley Scheider. They're my top tier subscribers. They are fantastic. If you want to join the Patreon, make sure you check out the link below. You get the videos a day early. You get to vote on the topic of the videos. You get to read the scripts early. You get to tell me what you think. It's all good. You get to join the Discord too, where I slag people off all the time. I don't really do that. But everyone, with that done, go play Dragon Age Origins, and I'll catch you next time.